Unlike most of the storms that had come before, Black Sunday arrived like a solid, immense structure that overtook the entire sky. On the horizon, the sky thickened into a single continuous wall. It stretched across the entire landscape, swallowing fields, fences, and roads in one advancing line of darkness. The wind intensified rapidly. Major dust storms at the time reached estimated peak gusts of around 60 to 100 miles per hour in many areas. But during the Black Sunday storm, localized gusts were reported to reach over the 110 mile per hour range in exposed, unprotected terrain, which is on par with a Category 2 hurricane. These dust storms would cause loose soil to lift almost immediately, pulled into the air in dense, rolling waves that erase distance and flatten depth until the landscape loses all definition. Visibility collapses from miles to a few yards and then to nothing as the storm consumes the land entirely. Daylight is stripped away as if someone turned off the sky. Within minutes, afternoon becomes night and the entire area plunges into darkness. The sound builds before anything else is fully lost. A low roar rises into a continuous, overwhelming force, like a never-ending freight train passing directly overhead, drowning out speech, thought, and any warning calls. When the dust storms would reach the neighborhoods and the farmhouses, sand would slam against any structure in its path, houses would strain under pressure, and the walls would vibrate with each gust. An entire farmhouse could feel like a tornado was forming right on top of it. Outside, during these storms, animals would panic, causing livestock to scatter blindly, unable to navigate open land. Oftentimes, livestock would go blind during black blizzards, running in circles until they collapsed and died from suffocation. Carcasses of wild animals like jackrabbits, birds, and field mice would be found by the hundreds. Birds would try to outfly the storms, but would often collapse mid-flight as the air became too dense to move and breathe through. These storms could cause entire fields to vanish. Even the distance between houses would become immeasurable. It was like entire homes got sucked into their own individual vacuums. Inside the homes, the world would shrink to wood, cloth, and breath. Families were forced to move quickly, sealing doors and windows with whatever they could find. It crept in around the frames, through keyholes, through seams in the walls, drifting in as fine, suffocating powder that would coat the inside of the home as fast as it entered. People would tie cloth over their mouths, but even that felt thin, useless, and already saturated in dirt. Breathing would become difficult almost immediately. Each inhale carried grit, each exhale turned into a cough that couldn't fully be cleared. Throats would scratch raw, and eyes would burn red. Outside, the storms were violent and relentless, but inside it was worse in a different way. When the storms would finally pass, they would stop suddenly, like the world was switched off and had just been turned back on. Roads became indistinct paths, cars would sit half-buried, buildings would still be standing, covered in a thick coating of soil that clung to every surface. The Dust Bowl was a massive environmental and economic catastrophe that didn't only affect the plains. The dust reached all the way up to the East Coast, and even up to 300 miles out into the Atlantic Ocean. In 1934, a huge dust cloud 2 miles high blanketed major cities like New York, Boston, Atlanta, Washington, D.C., and surrounding areas. The Great Plains region had been completely reshaped by decades of policy and promotion that encouraged settlement and intensive farming. Through aggressive land advertising that promoted the plains as a new Eden, the Homestead Act of 1862 and later land acts that offered 160 to 320 acres caused massive waves of migration. Popular claims that rain follows the plow helped drive widespread cultivation of native prairie grass, despite the region's natural vulnerability to drought. During World War I, expansion accelerated when wheat prices rose, mechanized tractors became more popular, and federal encouragement pushed farmers to break up millions of acres of drought-resistant grassland. It worked for a time, but the rain stopped in the early 1930s, and once the drought set in, the exposed soil had nothing to hold it in place, and that same land that was sold as opportunity began to disintegrate into dust. By the time the storms intensified, millions of people across states like Oklahoma, Texas, Kansas, Colorado, and New Mexico were already trapped in an unfolding crisis. Many families were unable to leave even as conditions worsened. Years of debt taken on for tractors, seed, and expansion left farmers vulnerable to foreclosure when crops failed, and thousands of family farms were eventually seized by the banks. The broader economic collapse of the Great Depression erased savings entirely, leaving families with no money to relocate or even to cover basic survival costs. Even for those who tried to escape, options were limited. Large-scale mechanized agriculture pushed out small farmers, while those who migrated west often encountered harsh conditions, overcrowded labor camps, and wages as low as 14 cents an hour. Others simply stayed because there was nowhere else to go and no system to support them if they left. Although Black Sunday couldn't have been entirely prevented, the broader disaster could have been avoided. This storm was about 4 years into the severe drought that defined the Dust Bowl. Estimates suggest that from the beginning to the end of the 1930s, over 2.5 million people were displaced from the plains, and hundreds of thousands of deaths were indirectly linked to serious health conditions brought on by the Dust Bowl. The most infamous condition was dust pneumonia, which was called the brown plague. It clogged lungs, caused chest pain, and was often fatal for children and the elderly. Not only that, but crop failure led to widespread malnutrition and economic ruin that took severe psychological tolls on the survivors. Trigger warning: mention of suicide. Skip like 10 seconds. During the Great Depression, the U.S. suicide rate surged at an all-time high of 22.1 per 100,000 people in 1932, which is around 27 to 28,000 deaths that year alone. Although economic ruin contributed heavily, historians also attribute the increase to a mix of unemployment, poverty, and local migration crises. Hundreds, if not thousands, of rural settlements, farming hamlets, and homesteading communities were completely abandoned during the 1930s. The Black Sunday storm only lasted a few hours, but the Dust Bowl was years of drought, failed harvests, and land that was pushed beyond its limits. Black Sunday was a visible moment that shined a light on a much larger scale of collapse already in motion. Across the 1930s, millions of acres of farmland were stripped of their topsoil and left exposed to the wind, while millions of people were forced to adapt, relocate, or endure conditions that made everyday life extremely difficult. New Eden was just another promise sold to the American people, promoted through poorly thought-out land policies and advertising. The Dust Bowl was one of the greatest man-made ecological disasters in American history, and even decades later, the scars left on the land and the people who live there have never fully healed. And that's it for today's story. And if you haven't already done so, please subscribe. Comment below on what hellish history, fucked up folklore, or mysterious monster you want me to drag into the light next. New videos drop every Tuesdays and Thursdays, and maybe sometimes more if I feel like it. Until then, keep your doors locked, candles lit, and mind open. Sweet screams.